Hi, I'm Kurt Doolittle from Proprietary Institute of Natural Law, and Dr. Brad is here, again, coaching me through the process of releasing the method. I want to insert here again that Dr. Brad doesn't necessarily agree with everything I say at all. I am the only person responsible for what I say.
Oh my, all the necessary disclaimers, huh?
Anyway, so we have gone through the method part 1. Today we're beginning part 2, first principles. So if we recall, what we're trying to do is produce the method in order to produce the operational grammar. And in producing the operational grammar, we understand that there are inflationary and deflationary grammars. Inflationary and deflationary grammars are, again, universal, except they differ in value attribution by culture, given culture, class, and sex, given the difference in values between the cultures, classes, and sexes, given the group strategy of the difference between the cultures, classes, and cultures, classes, and sexes. All right. So once we've done that, we've created a system of measurement for language, but we have to bind language with to first principles. In other words, we have to discover the limits. So in order to create an argument, you need to not only know operational language, but you need the first principles from which to construct an argument with any given domain. So right now we know the first principles of language. Now we're going to put together the first principles of the rest of the disciplines or the sciences. So I hope that idea gets across. We did the first principles of language into a system of measurement, and now we're taking from language, we're working through the disciplines. So we're going to work through pretty much all of them that matter. I'm not going to go into math, for example, or in the book I go into math and logic, but that's just not suitable for the visual format. So we're beginning part 2. We're going to discuss the hierarchy of first principles. There's a physical universe. It has some set of physical laws. My present understanding is there's 2 more levels down from the quantum. We'll find out if that's true, but that's my understanding. And at some point, we'll know those first principles. However, the first principle of everything that the human being can experience is driven by entropy. So in other words, whatever happens below entropy doesn't matter. That's the lowest level of causality that affects anything to do with life. So we're going to try to discover the first causes at every stage of stable equilibrium. That means quantum is a stable equilibrium. In other words, we can develop a set of first principles and a logic at the quantum. We can do it at the atomic, at the elemental rather, at the chemical, at the biological, and all the way up. Well, we're talking about taking that simple thing and applying it, the hierarchy, and a stable relation is just a Markov chain where the set of states which can be transformed. So we're actually describing all of reality by its first principles. So we're going to do the same technique, though. We're going to continuously disambiguate into realism and naturalism, which are the universe is constructed out of what we cast as material, whether we want to consider the subatomic as material or not is open to, it's a verbalism. It produces the ability for us to act is within the material world. So just as entropy is the lowest level of causality that's meaningful to human action, the material world is the lowest level of resolution that's necessary for human action. So again, we're going to use a continuous recursive disambiguation by exhaustive adversarial competition, which means analysis, deconstruction, and falsification, and reconstruction of the formal physical, behavioral, and evolutionary sciences using a single, most parsimonious, value-neutral paradigm, vocabulary, logic, and grammar. And we're going to produce commensurability across all human display, word, and deed from those first principles, and that will permit us to create a system of logic, vastly reducing our ability to use ignorance, error, bias, argument, and deceit, especially in law where we're trying to resolve differences, not just form associations that convey meaning. And our hope is to end the long history of lying in public to the public in matters public. and as we just discussed before, is therefore to drive us all into reciprocal exchanges using that market we call government, or the houses of government, to achieve in politics what we achieve in the market for consumption. So there are problems getting to first causes and first principles. Some of them are because we don't want to, so, because we all have our cherished falsehoods. My cherished falsehood is I'm tall, dark, and handsome. We all have cherished falsehoods. So, the problem is getting there. But it's also because it requires a lot of domain knowledge. So, intuition is pretty hard to trade for reason. So intuition is cheap. It's just auto association. We try to avoid reasoning. We definitely avoid calculating, and we certainly avoid computing at all costs, because we simply want to go by rules of thumb and auto association. That's normal neural economy at practice, right? This is a very expensive thing. Secondly, you've got to rebuild this. You have to have a lot of domain knowledge. I mean, you have to know enough about each discipline to be able to know when you've discovered its first principles. Once you know like 3 disciplines, you've sort of got it. It takes about 3. Learning 1, you know a thing. Learning 2, now you can say, well, yeah, I understood it this way in that discipline, but when I see both. But once you sort of got, if you've got economics and engineering and medicine, I mean, that's it, right? I mean, you know the world, right? I mean, the body, how we work together, and how the physical world works. And, once you get 3, it becomes a lot harder to rely on your intuition that's been framed by disciplinary narrowness to form your conclusions. So you tend to roll it out. So, I mean, we have 3 sets of faculties: our perception, intuition, the physical sensation and action, and our mental calculation and verbal ability. We have these, the intuition, reason, and physical action. And, if you've got a discipline that handles each one of those, you'll probably come to the right spot in the middle where you found some average. This is why intellectuals always fail. Thomas Sowell wrote a great book on this, on intellectuals and society, and he wrote a couple others. But the problem is intellectuals tend to be narrow, so they come out and we produce. In an age of mass communication, they can produce a lot of ideas, but they're not accountable for them like a manufacturer was. And so you can have generations of ideas that fail, like Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, woke, PC, whatever, just like you can have generations in medicine that turned out to be wrong and generations in physics that turned out to be wrong. You can have these different ideas because specialists advocate them, but it's just a process of trial and error. The problem is intellectuals, unlike doctors or engineers or jurists, are unaccountable for their actions. And so they tend to spew a great deal of faulty product without being liable for it. Training a person to read or do arithmetic is actually quite difficult. We're asking you to calculate. In those cases, you're trying to overcome the natural tendency not to maintain discrete states. Whereas in this case, what you're trying to do is train the person not to rely on intuition, and that's far harder. So many people will come to P-Law and I don't want to learn that. Well, of course, because it forces you, like reading or writing or arithmetic or some other discipline, to modify your behavior so that you're less dependent on the animal and you're more dependent on being a human. So developing an intuition, getting to the point where you've developed an intuition to argue from first principles, requires practice, just like reading, writing, and mathematics require practice. You can't just do it off the top of your head. I mean, that's what everybody wants from me. It's like, well, if you want an ideology, go find one. If you want to, but religions take time too. The sciences take time, and this one takes a lot more time because you've got to counter the strongest will in the human mind, which is to overcome the continuous demand for neural efficiency by avoiding computation and calculation and reason at all times, thereby limiting yourself to intuition. So it's an investment and return. You've got to invest quite a bit up front to develop the returns of your intuition being transformed from the animal to the human, which means from the your instincts, your animal instincts, and accidental idiosyncratic experience, just like we've trained people from a million individual rules about the physical world into the sciences so that they can perceive the world as coherent systems rather than as discrete rules, which is what accounts for most of the apparent increase in intelligence since the introduction of education, is really the introduction of science, because science teaches you a small number of general rules with wide application that work together in harmony to help you understand the world. Well, in essence, what we're doing is the same thing. We're continuing that practice out of the physical sciences into the social science, psychological and social sciences, producing a small number of coherent rules that allow you to understand that this is a system of thinking, not just idiosyncratic things you picked up in history based on fragments, because intuition doesn't require a series of logical steps. It's the same reason we've built these new AIs, which are really Bayesian accounting systems. That's great, except you can't ask it why it came up with that. It doesn't know. We're trying to make it so that we do know how we came up with something, and we know furthermore how other people came up with something. Intellectually dishonest people, intentionally or not, won't follow you across steps of logic. So what you'll find is people don't seek to understand, they seek to disagree based on the original premise. Whereas if you want to become a rational person, your goal is to seek to understand and then to understand whether that's true or false. What most people will do when they are empathic or they are relying on intuition and resistance to learning, which means resistance to change, is they will refuse to seek to understand. They will block and obfuscate your questions. They'll put roadblocks into it, and they will deny the fact that you're making a logical progression of steps. This is particularly difficult for what I do because everything I do depends on a chain of reasoning. So it's pointless to try to argue with intellectually dishonest people. Since the intellectually dishonest people are common, the only way to do that is legislate it.
It comes down to that is, and this is me making a diversion, the Marxists appear to have no compunction about anything you say. They just want power, and they're willing to say whatever it takes to get it.
Again, I'm not trying to pick on the culture or something, but it's why the Middle East is the Middle East.
I understand, and I just feel like this. It's like, yes, because you can't deal with them by rational means, it seems.
Right. If you can't negotiate, you need either offense or defense. Well, law is the defensive method by which to protect against the intellectually dishonest people. You can have the offensive method. I mean, you want to call the Nazis, that's what their approach was.
That's war. We're just war.
That's war. And so you can have the offensive military solution, or you can have the defensive legal solution. The law creates a market for the suppression of intellectual dishonesty, but as well as ignorance, error, and bias. So we need to create laws as a defensive measure against people whose every incentive is to preserve their method of deceit in order to preserve their self-image of status, rather than drive them into the market for cooperation in the production of commons we call government. I mean, that's what a modern government is, right? I mean, we don't think of it that we put this holy wrapper around of democracy, but what the modern state is, as designed by the Greeks, the Romans, and the English, is that you're creating a market between the classes for the voluntary production of commons within the limits of the law. And I don't mean the law like government law, I mean the law like natural law. So the purpose of our system of government is to drive us into voluntary cooperation. The mistake we made, of course, is we opened the franchise without requiring truthful reciprocal discourse. So it's worse that people admit that physical science is hard, right? They'll say, oh, that's hard. Calculus is hard. And they'll come to me, this can't be true. It's a bunch of word salad. Well, calculus and subatomic physics are going to be word solid to you too. Just because they're hard doesn't mean they're false. It usually means the opposite. Biochemistry is hard. In fact, it's hard doesn't mean it's false. It's just hard. So people want something intuitionistic, which is why I say we have to develop the law, because you can make an intuitionistic lie that saves you from calculation and cooperation, but it preserves your ability to use or rely on intuition, but you can't create an intuitionistic truth that costs you neural effort and learning and transformation and time and effort, and tells you can't steal, lie, cheat, and steal anymore. We get this problem, and especially in morality and politics, where morality, we're demonstrating here that ethics, morality, and social science and psychology are scientific and calculable. But you ask the same person a question about biochemistry, and they don't know the answer, they'll just say, well, I just don't know. But if you ask them a moral or political question, they'll offer an opinion as if they know, when what they actually have is equivalent of superstition. So everyone presumes they're competent in truth, ethics, and morality. What they're actually saying is, I want, not it is.
It's preference.
It's preference. It's a demonstration of they're advertising the terms by which they are willing to cooperate. However, the terms by which they're willing to cooperate might be possible or not, or desirable or not, and might cause other people. So natural law is the term by which everybody's paying the same cost, which is I can't impose costs upon others. So only after you go through this problem of learning the first principles and overcoming your intuition and paying the cost of calculation in the behavioral sciences, just as we've developed intuitions in the physical sciences, it's only after you know it, you realize how unconscious we were.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
All right, so you realize how dumb we were before science, the physical sciences. You're going to realize once you learn this, how dumb we were in the behavioral sciences. I mean, it's the normal course of evolution. You just wonder if a few things hadn't gone wrong, why we lost 1,000 years to the Dark Ages, maybe 1,500. And we've almost lost modern civilization to the same idea again. This, first time was Judaism, Christianity, Islam, mostly Islam. And the second time it's Marxism, postmodernism, neo-Marxism, PC woke, and Islam. So, I mean, we're having the same problem all over again. You have a sort of more intellectual version of destroying civilization and a more theological version or empathic means of destroying civilization. But in either event, they're both cancers to civilization and to mankind itself. You didn't like that. You can't see this because Brad, when the slide is up, you can't see Brad's face, and he winces whenever I say anything judgmental. So that's why I started out with, he doesn't agree with everything I say. He's just coaching me through the process and crossing his fingers the whole time I don't say anything offensive.
I'm not hoping that you're not going to say something offensive, okay? It's not so much if, but when, excuse me.
When I'm going to say something offensive? Okay. So it's just like we developed agency over the world by the Indo-European, in other words, mankind developed agency independent of nature in the Indo-European Revolution. So what we think of as the Indo-European expansion and the Indo-European languages, that was the primacy of man. So it's heroic, militaristic, expansionary, sky-worshipping, meritocratic, and a couple of other properties. That was an invention of man by the Europeans who combined horse, bronze, and wheel and escaped many of the limitations that they had before thought captured man at the mercy of elements and others. And so that was the first revolution. We had a second revolution with reason, with the Greek reason. We had a third revolution with European science. We had a fourth revolution with the European industrialization. And we're having a fifth revolution in the behavioral sciences. And so we're trying to bring about is the same thing that happened in the physical sciences, same thing that happened in the ancient world, same thing that happened in the physical sciences, and now we're trying to bring that into the behavioral sciences. Okay. And if we can do that by producing a specification for the requirements for truthful speech, reciprocal action, good government, and moral policy, so we can discuss policy that's practical and scientific rather than philosophical, theological, ideological, or whatever. So my goal is to produce a government that produces good policy that's in the interest of everyone so that we use the law to drive out ignorance, error, bias, deceit, fraud, wishful thinking, etc., and especially baiting into hazard, and this pursuit of power by those who don't deserve it and cause harm because of it. And instead that we drive everyone into a market, which we call the government or the houses of government, that produce commons that are reciprocally beneficial regardless of our substantive differences. Let's see. We're going to use the adversarial method again. Everything starts with physics, or with entropy. We disambiguate any claim until it's dependent on the stable equilibrium below it. So chemistry has to be demonstrated by dependent upon physics. Biochemistry has to be dependent upon the first principles of chemistry. We follow this chain up. So this first set of causes we're going to go through is following this chain upward. For example, in mathematics, we have a thing called symmetries, which is really simple. If you take a thing, apply a change, and it remains stable, right? That's the same thing what we say an atom, an element. It remains stable. I mean, under most conditions, you add heat or you add natural decay, you add these things. So there's things that remain stable. So these are stable equilibrium at each level of abstraction. So it's a step ladder, right? Each step of complexity depends on the first principles of the prior. So we can speak in elements, we can speak in chemistry, we can speak in biochemistry, we can speak in organic life, we can speak in neurology, we can speak in cognition, we can speak in reasoning. And underneath, each one is dependent on the ladder before it. And that competition is what makes sure we're coherent. So if I come up with a thing that has to fit inside biochemistry, it has to fit between this and this hierarchy. That's an adversarial competition, just like putting words in a line in the method creates an adversarial competition.
In order for it to exist in that space, it must not be the step below or the step above.
It must not violate the step below or the step above. So I'm trying to get across, it's the same damn thing. We'll get into this later in triangulation. I mean, when you use numbers, you're using a cardinal measure. When you put things in order, you're using an ordinal measure. Well, there's some things we can assign a quantitative value, and some of it we can only assign an ordinal value.
Okay.
So when we're ordering words, we're not giving them a cardinal value, we're giving them an ordinal value. When we're organizing the methods, we're not giving a cardinal value. With the sciences, we're going the ordinal. So therefore, any rule within one method, one discipline, at one level of this hierarchy of grammars, can't violate the laws above it or below it. So it's adversarial, just like terms. The same thing with sentences. We take a sentence and we expand the sentence. And by expanding the sentence, we put every concept in the sentence in adversarial competition with every other.
Right.
So we serialize words to produce competitions. We serialize sentences, so we organize sentences to produce a competition. We organize narratives to produce a competition. And likewise, we look for first causes, just as we found the first causes of language, we look for first causes in the hierarchy of complexity that emerges from each first cause, and we put them in competition and say, okay, well, it's like saying, well, it violates realism and naturalism, so it can't be true. Well, that's the most basic thing that says it can't be actionable. If it's there's no causal relation it can have. You can go down to the next level and say, well, there's no room anywhere left for magic to process. In other words, once we understand the subatomic level, you realize there's no room for magic to go anywhere. In other words, there's no means of informational transmission other than the ones we know about. So there can't be magic.
No supernatural forces.
There's no supernatural forces. So that's what saying, did you violate realism and natural meaning? If you did, then one is you're either using an analogy or using a lie. Which one are you using? An analogy to convey meaning or a lie to create a false measurement? I said, explain this process in detail is beyond the scope, but really we just did it.
Right, go back to that slide one more time.
Okay.
Please. I'm reading the second paragraph from the bottom. Continuous logic of the formal physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, political, and economic, group, strategic, and evolutionary domains. That's wonderful. Those are all a series of domains that are an increasing in complexity.
Correct.
The scope of the activity that we're engaged in here. Is that fair?
Right. I mean, in the book, I go into the logics in extraordinary detail, but that's partly because it's fascinating to me, right? I go into math in extraordinary detail because I want to eliminate the ability of other thinkers to try to lie, cheat, and deceive about what I'm saying. And so I think it's going to be pretty damn difficult to do that, honestly, but I want to make sure I answered all these questions. You get a lot of nonsense out of math because math uses a very archaic set of language. Math and law and philosophy, they use very archaic terms and for very archaic sets of reasoning that are no longer necessary. So I have a little problem with mathematicians. So they're like, well, it's okay in math. Well, that doesn't mean it's true. It means it works. I'm trying to explain why it works, and you're trying to claim it's true. Those are two different things. You can do it, meaning it produces the outcome you want, is different from the fact that it's coherent and consistent with the laws of the universe. Whereas if you say it this way, it's coherent and consistent with the laws of the universe, and then you can still do what you're claiming. You just can't claim it's magic. Anyway, so I've just explained how we use adversarial competition. The universe uses evolutionary computation. Whenever there's two forces, this is the basic law of ternary law. If you have two positive and negative charges in any kind of disorder, they will discover an equilibrium, at which point there is no disorder. That is a subset of whatever else is going. In other words, some percent of those two charges will produce a stable equilibrium somewhere. Right? From that stable equilibrium in that world, under different conditions, we will produce different stable equilibrium. All of the universe evolves step by step out of this process of discovering. It's easy to talk about chemistry this way, right? And understand chemistry. Once you get into biochemistry and proteins, it's different because they're able to do their own work. Right, so they build up a charge, they do something, they come back. So we don't think of proteins or molecules, biomechanical molecules, as doing work, but they are. Whereas in chemistry, we've got to apply conditions in order for work to occur. So we get into biochemistry, work can happen by its own.
Right.
So this stepwise process continues of producing stable equilibrium. So ternaryism is that this is the minimum computation, this is the minimum necessary for computation, is a positive, a negative, and a stable equilibrium, an opposing force and a stable equilibrium between them. And so that's the minimum. So that's why if you look at almost everything we're going to do, and if you look at why we represent the world with triangles, it's because that's all there is. There's stable equilibrium in the middle, continue where we're going, turn left or turn right. So this is a very simple charge, 0, 1, and -1. So this basic necessity of the universe, this first principle, turns out to be applicable at infinite scale. So all we're going to see is this positive and negative, stable equilibrium in the middle, things emerging out of stable equilibrium into more complex stable equilibrium. We're going to see this evolve throughout. This is one of the more simplifying parts of my work. Methodological Ternayism, which is to look for this, helps you discover how all these first principles work. In this case, I'm saying, in the text here, I'm saying it's the minimum choice Markov chain. Stay where we are, go this way, go that way, ternary. So the whole universe is built out of that simple, called a Markov chain.
Sure.
And this is why I think when the debate over who's going the right direction, I'm a fan of Stephen Wolfram, because his new math is essentially a trial and error method of creating Markov chains to see what emerges from Markov chains. So in his method, you describe a Markov chain, a simple one, and you run a simulation on it, and you see what emerges, and it looks like he's correctly emerging the properties of the universe. So if we can't conduct measurements that allow us to discover the next level of first principles, let's just do it how the universe does, and let's do it by trial and error. And he's developed this software that does this. Is why I don't know if he'll get there first, but the method he's choosing, from my understanding, is more likely to produce it than the century we've spent now on trying to develop measurements that will tell you about a system that by definition can't tolerate being measured. Sorry, I did go into too much of a digression there. I don't know.
Okay.
There's the kind of nerds that watch this probably love it. You never know. Then we take this ternaryism, we put it in under adversarialism. We see what survives, and that's just evolution. So I'm talking about evolutionary process not as biological, but as from first principles of the universe, as a system of calculation using a very simple ternary algorithm to use adversarial competition to produce survival of increasingly complex states of stable equilibrium. In other words, I'm talking about looking at the universe as calculating. And if you look at how physicists now talk about the universe, they talk about it as information instead of force. All right, given the hierarchy of recursive memory that we have in our heads, the sensations that we can get from our neurons, which are really just pulses, the ability to disambiguate, by meaning organize our neural stimulation by adversarial competition for predictive coherence in short periods of time, and our ability to predict from memory from previous memories how those things will fit together in the shortest period, and our ability to produce response, impulse, and choice, and develop attention from the peak victory of that competition. And then we choose to release an action or not, and we loop on this process. There's no difference between that and the very basic loop of the universe. What we do here in our heads, while it seems elaborate, is just the same thing that's happening at every other level. So our brain is just another extension of the physical universe at increasingly abstract scale. It's glorious. It's wonderful. It's almost, if there is a magic in the universe, it's intelligence, but it's not supernatural. And that produces, at our scale, at the human scale, adaptation by self-organization of survival. And again, we're, as living organisms, participating in continuous recursive disambiguation. In other words, we're organizing ourselves for greater consumption and retention of energy, which is why there's no end to the human consumption of energy. So we're producing evolutionary computation. All right, so if I've beat that idea of evolutionary computation up well enough. So I've worked on this so long and I've looked at it so many times, it just looks really normal to me. So I can't really interpret how the average person sees it. But this is for all intents and purposes the list of first principles we can testify to. This is the introduction to what we're going to do. So if you want to see a chapter outline, this is what we have to cover. What's testifiable, the metaphysical, the existential, the possible. What's psychological, the rational, the reciprocal. What's sociological, which is the second column. So you have one is the whole spectrum, two is psychological, and three is social. We can only testify to what's testifiable, and that's metaphysical, existential, possible, psychological, sociological, complete, competitive, and warrantable. We can only testify to those things. Within rational, we can only testify to rational choice by demonstrated preferences given these incentives, and we can only testify to what's reciprocal by the same means. And then in the second column, if anything's social, we can only testify to the things that are there. And so this is the outline of all the first principles we're going to sort of talk about. That's the conclusion of the introduction to first principles. If I've been successful, I've gotten across the idea of evolutionary computation, and the universalism of the evolutionary computation across the entire spectrum of human knowledge, and that in here, and that this culminates in a set of first principles, just like we've solved the first principles of language, the first principles of the universe that we can testify about. and that this is all one continuous coherent spectrum based on a very simple algorithm that I'll call ternary logic or ternaryism, which is that any two conflicting states will eventually produce some subset of them as stable equilibrium, from which the hierarchy of stable equilibriums emerge, and as a system of computation by trial and error. And well, the universe can't trial and error, but it will simply discover stable equilibrium. As each level of stable equilibrium matures, we have the same process continue, and we get life, and we get planets, we get life, we get everything out of the universe out of it. And so so our language is just a reflection of that same process all the way up. And our communication is a reflection of it. Our cooperation is a reflection of it. Our evolution is a reflection of it. And it's the same thing from entropy on up to whatever we evolve into. This is Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. Thanks for joining us on our little journey. Hope you stick with us. Have a good day.